When David Chen spotted the listing for a mountain cabin priced at just $500, he thought it was a mistake. His mother, Eleanor, was recovering from cancer treatments, and the doctor said mountain air might help her healing. The cabin sat on 3 acres of pine forest, 2 hours from the nearest town. The seller seemed eager to get rid of it, asking no questions and accepting cash on the spot. The moment they stepped inside, David knew why it was so cheap. Dust sheets covered furniture that looked decades old. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, showing strangers from another era. The kitchen still held canned goods from the 1970s. It was as if the previous owners had simply vanished one day, leaving everything behind. But what connection did this forgotten family have to David's own past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gravel road leading to the cabin had been more suggestion than reality, forcing David to navigate his Honda Civic through ruts that seemed designed to discourage visitors. Eleanor sat quietly in the passenger seat, her thin frame wrapped in the wool blanket she'd insisted on bringing, despite the late spring warmth. The chemotherapy had left her looking fragile, but her eyes held a brightness David hadn't seen in months. "Turn left at that fallen pine," she said suddenly, pointing ahead. David glanced at her, puzzled. "Mom, how do you know where we're going?" "We've never been here before." Eleanor paused, her brow furrowing slightly. I'm not sure. It just feels familiar somehow." The cabin materialized through the trees like something from a half-remembered dream. Built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to a silvery gray, it sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines and aspens. A wraparound porch sagged slightly on one side, and morning glory vines had claimed the latticework beneath it. Despite the obvious neglect, the structure possessed a dignity that spoke of careful craftsmanship and enduring love. David parked beside an old stone well and helped his mother from the car. The mountain air was crisp and thin, carrying scents of pine sap and wildflowers. Eleanor took a deep breath and smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since her diagnosis 6 months ago. "It smells like home," she whispered. Inside, the cabin was a museum of interrupted life. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in decades. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace with a rough-hewn mantel. Above it, a collection of family photographs watched over the space like benevolent guardians. David studied the largest photograph, a formal portrait of what appeared to be a family from the 1970s, a man with kind eyes and graying temples stood behind a woman with dark hair and an elegant smile. Between them sat 2 children, a boy about 10 and a girl perhaps 8. The woman bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor, though David couldn't quite place why. "Look at this kitchen," Eleanor called from the adjoining room. "They have the same vintage chamber stove I learned to cook on when I was little." David found her running her hands along the white enamel surface of an old gas range. Copper pots hung from hooks on a pegboard, and mason jars filled with preserved foods lined open shelves. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but nothing appeared damaged or disturbed. "Mom, your adoptive parents had an electric stove. I remember visiting Grandma and Grandpa's house." Eleanor looked up, confusion flickering across her features. "Of course they did. I don't know why I said that." She shook her head as if clearing cobwebs. "This mountain air must be affecting my thinking." They spent the afternoon exploring, David carrying their few bags upstairs while Eleanor investigated the main floor. The cabin held 3 bedrooms upstairs and 1 down, each furnished with heavy wooden pieces that spoke of simpler times. Quilts covered the beds, their patterns still vibrant despite years of storage. In what had clearly been the master bedroom, David discovered something that made his breath catch. Sitting on the vanity table was a small wooden music box, its lid slightly ajar. When he lifted it, a tiny ballerina began to turn to the melody of Fur Elise. "Mom," he called downstairs. You need to see this. Eleanor climbed the stairs slowly, her energy flagging as the day wore on. When she saw the music box, she sank onto the edge of the bed, as if her legs had given out. That's impossible, she breathed. What's impossible? I had one exactly like this when I was very small. Exactly like this. Same ballerina, same song, even the same little chip on the corner. Her voice grew distant. I lost it when we moved and I cried for days. My mother, my adoptive mother, said we'd get another one, but we never did. David picked up the music box, examining it closely. The wood showed signs of age, and there was indeed a small chip on one corner. But what struck him most was the inscription on the bottom, written in faded ink, "For our little Eleanor Rose. With all our love." Eleanor's maiden name had been Rose. As evening approached, David built a fire in the great stone fireplace, using wood he found stacked neatly on the back porch. Eleanor sat in a rocking chair that seemed molded to fit her body, watching the flames dance. For the first time since her diagnosis, she looked peaceful. "David," she said softly, "I know this sounds strange, but I feel stronger here. Like this place is giving me something I've been missing." Looking at his mother's face in the firelight, David had to admit she did look better. The hollow exhaustion that had marked her features for months seemed to be lifting. Whether it was the mountain air, the peace of isolation, or something else entirely, he was grateful. But the music box sat on the mantel now, and every time its melody drifted through the cabin, David wondered about the family who had left it behind. The next morning, David woke to the sound of his mother humming in the kitchen. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard her hum anything. Sunlight streamed through windows that Eleanor had somehow managed to clean while he slept, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. "I found coffee in the pantry," she called as he descended the creaking stairs. "Still sealed, dated just last year. Someone must have been maintaining this place." Eleanor moved around the kitchen with surprising energy, her steps light and purposeful. She'd already discovered where everything belonged, opening cabinets and drawers with the confidence of long familiarity. David watched her navigate the space as if she'd spent years here instead of hours. "How did you know the coffee was in that particular canister?" he asked. Eleanor paused, her hand still on the blue ceramic container. "I could guess." She laughed, but uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "This whole place just feels so natural to me, like muscle memory." After breakfast, they began the work of making the cabin truly livable. David tackled the heavier cleaning while Eleanor sorted through drawers and closets, separating items that belonged to the previous owners from basic household goods they could use. The work seemed to energize her rather than drain her, and David marveled at the transformation. In the afternoon, Eleanor decided to explore the surrounding property. The cabin sat at the center of 3 wooded acres, with stone-lined paths winding through stands of aspen and pine. Some paths were overgrown, but others showed signs of recent maintenance, as if someone had been caring for the property even while the cabin stood empty. "David, come look at this," Eleanor called from somewhere beyond the tree line. He found her standing beside a small stone cottage, partially hidden by overgrown lilac bushes. The structure was older than the main cabin, built from the same grey stone as the well. Wooden shutters hung at odd angles, and the door stood slightly ajar. "It's like a fairy tale," Eleanor said, pushing aside the lilac branches. "I wonder what they used it for." Inside, the cottage held garden tools, clay pots, and bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars containing seeds and what appeared to be homemade remedies. A workbench ran along one wall, its surface scarred from years of use. Eleanor moved through the space with the same intuitive knowledge she'd shown in the main cabin. She opened drawers in a specific order, found items exactly where she seemed to expect them. In the largest drawer, beneath packets of lavender seeds, she discovered something that made her gasp. A leather gardening journal lay open to a page dated May 15th, 1978. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, with careful notes about planting schedules and soil conditions. But it was the pressed flower on the facing page that caught Eleanor's attention. A perfect white lily, still fragrant after all these years. My mother always pressed flowers, Eleanor whispered, her fingers hovering over the delicate petals. She taught me when I was very small. We'd make bookmarks and decorations together. David looked over her shoulder. Your adoptive mother? No, not her. Someone else. Someone I can barely remember. Eleanor's voice grew distant. I have these fragments of memory, like glimpses through fog. A woman with gentle hands, showing me how to place flowers between sheets of wax paper. The smell of lavender and mint. But when I try to focus on her face, it slips away. They carried the journal back to the main cabin as evening approached. Eleanor settled into her rocking chair, while David prepared a simple dinner from supplies they'd brought. The rhythm of domestic life seemed to suit this place, as if the cabin itself encouraged a slower, more mindful way of being. As darkness fell, Eleanor opened the gardening journal again, studying each page with careful attention. The entries spanned several years, documenting not just plants and seasons, but small observations about daily life. References to little Eleanor's favorite hiding spot and Eleanor's tea party rock appeared throughout the pages. David, Eleanor said quietly, what if I wasn't born in the city like my adoptive parents told me? What if I lived here as a very small child? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to explore. David had always known his mother was adopted. Her parents had never hidden that fact. But they'd always said she came to them as an infant from a young mother who couldn't care for her. Mom. Adoptive parents sometimes don't know all the details about their children's early lives, but what if they did know? Eleanor's eyes reflected the firelight. What if there were things they thought it was better I didn't remember? Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, and the cabin settled around them with gentle creaks and whispers. Eleanor closed the journal and held it against her chest, as if trying to absorb whatever secrets it might contain. That night, David lay awake listening to his mother's peaceful breathing from the room next door. For the first time in months, she wasn't coughing or restless with pain. Whatever was happening here, it was helping her heal. But healing sometimes meant confronting truths that had been buried for good reason. 3 days into their stay, David decided to tackle the attic. Eleanor had been spending more time in the garden cottage, reading through the journal and tending to herbs that somehow still grew wild around the property. Her improvement was remarkable. The color had returned to her cheeks, and she moved with an energy he hadn't seen since before her diagnosis. The attic access was a narrow stairway hidden behind a door David had initially mistaken for a closet. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of light from his flashlight as he climbed into the cramped space under the eaves. The air smelled of old wood and something else, lavender and roses, as if someone had stored potpourri up here decades ago. Boxes lined the walls, each labeled in the same elegant handwriting he'd seen in the gardening journal. Christmas decorations, Thomas's army papers, Margaret's teaching materials, the names from the family portrait downstairs. David opened several boxes, finding exactly what their labels promised. Nothing surprising until he reached a small cedar chest tucked behind the others. Unlike the other containers, this chest bore no label. The cedar was polished smooth by countless hands, and brass hinges had aged to a deep patina. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at his touch, David found a collection of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The return addresses made his hands tremble. Thomas Whitmore, stationed in Korea, and Margaret Rose, Millfield Teachers College. The postmarks dated from 1952 to 1954, but it was Margaret's maiden name that made David sink onto an old trunk, his heart racing. Rose, the same surname Eleanor had carried before her marriage. With careful fingers, he untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. Thomas's handwriting was bold and confident, the words of a young soldier desperate to return to the woman he loved. My dearest Margaret, the letter began. I dream of the cabin we'll build together. where we'll raise our children in the mountain air I remember from my boyhood. I can see you there, tending your garden, teaching our little ones about the healing plants your grandmother showed you." David's chest tightened as he read on. Letter after letter revealed the passionate love story between Thomas Whitmore and Margaret Rose, the woman in the family portrait who looked so much like his mother. Their correspondence painted a picture of deep devotion, shared dreams and plans for a future, together in the mountains, but it was Margaret's letters that shattered everything David thought. He knew about his family, "My darling Thomas," she wrote. In one dated December 1954, "I have wonderful news that I've been saving for your return. We're going to have a baby. Dr. Henderson confirms I'm about 3 months along. Our child will be born in the spring, right here in our beloved cabin, just as we always dreamed." David's hands shook as he calculated the dates. If Margaret had been 3 months pregnant in December 1954, the baby would have been born in May 1955. Eleanor's birthday was May 15th, 1955. He fumbled through more letters, finding Margaret's excited preparations for motherhood, Thomas's joy at the news, and their plans for the nursery they would build in the cabin's smallest bedroom. The same room where David had found the music box inscribed, "For our little Eleanor Rose." The final letter in the bundle was different from the others. Written in Margaret's hand, but with shaky, urgent strokes, it was dated May 20th, 1955, 5 days after Eleanor's birth. "Thomas, something terrible has happened. The men came in the night, just as your father warned they might. They knew about the healing place, about what your family has protected for generations. I had to make a choice to keep Eleanor safe. By the time you read this, she'll be far away, with people who can give her a normal life. The adoption papers are signed. Please don't try to find her. It's the only way to keep her from the burden our families have carried. I love you both with all my heart. M." David sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by the evidence of his mother's true origins. Eleanor wasn't just familiar with this cabin, she had been born here. Margaret Rose was her biological mother, Thomas Whitmore her father. The music box, the gardening journal, the way she moved through the spaces with such natural ease, it all made sense now. But the letter raised more questions than it answered. What had Margaret meant about the healing place and the burden their families carried? What men had come in the night, and why had Eleanor been given away to protect her from something? Downstairs, he could hear his mother humming as she prepared lunch. She was getting stronger every day they stayed here, as if the mountain air and the cabin itself were healing her in ways modern medicine couldn't explain. David carefully retied the letters and carried them downstairs. Eleanor was standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden where wildflowers grew in patterns that seemed almost deliberately arranged. "Mom," he said gently, "we need to talk." Eleanor set down her coffee cup with trembling hands after David finished reading Margaret's final letter aloud. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 38 years of hidden truth. Outside, wind rustled through the aspens, their leaves catching afternoon light like scattered coins. "Margaret Rose," Eleanor whispered, testing the name on her tongue. "My mother's name was Margaret Rose." David reached across the kitchen table and took her hand. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I know this must be overwhelming." Eleanor pulled her hand away and walked to the window, her movements sharp with sudden energy. "Overwhelming? David, this explains everything. The dreams I've had my whole life about a woman singing to me in a garden. The way I knew where things were in this cabin. The music box that was somehow exactly like mine." She turned back to face him, and David was startled by the fierce intensity in her eyes. "My adoptive parents lied to me for 38 years. They told me my birth mother was a teenager who couldn't care for me, that I was born in the city hospital. But I was born here in this cabin, to parents who loved me enough to give me up, to keep me safe." Safe from what, though? David gathered the letters carefully. Margaret's letter mentions men coming in the night, something about a healing place and family burdens. What could have been so dangerous that she felt she had to give up her own daughter? Eleanor began pacing the small kitchen, her bare feet silent on the worn wooden floors. "I don't know, but I intend to find out. There has to be more information somewhere in this cabin. People don't just disappear without leaving traces." David had been dreading this moment since finding the letters. "Mom, there's something else. I found these in a cedar chest in the attic, but I also saw boxes labeled with Thomas's army papers and Margaret's teaching materials. We could look through everything, but what? Are you sure you want to know? Sometimes the truth about why children are given up for adoption is more painful than not." Knowing, Eleanor stopped pacing and looked at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Not the tired resignation of a cancer patient, but the determined fire of someone who had found her purpose. "David, I've spent 6 months believing I was dying. The doctors gave me a 20% chance of surviving another year. But look at me now." She gestured to herself, and David had to admit she looked better than she had in years. "Since we've been here, I haven't needed my pain medication. I'm sleeping through the night. I have energy I haven't felt since before the diagnosis." She walked to the kitchen counter and picked up a manila envelope David hadn't noticed before. "I found this in the master bedroom this morning, tucked inside the frame of that big mirror. It has my name on it." The envelope was yellowed with age, and written across the front in Margaret's careful script was, "For Eleanor Rose Whitmore, when she comes home." David's breath caught. When she comes home. Not if. She knew I'd come back somehow. Eleanor's voice was soft with wonder. She believed I'd find my way here. With steady hands, Eleanor opened the envelope and withdrew a single sheet of paper. It was a birth certificate, official and legal, listing Eleanor Rose Whitmore, born May 15, 1955, at Whitmore Cabin, Cascade County. Parents Thomas James Whitmore and Margaret Rose Whitmore, but there was something else in the envelope, a small brass key attached to a piece of string. "What do you think it opens?" David asked. Eleanor held the key up to the light, examining its simple design. "I don't know, but I think Margaret wanted me to find out." She looked at David with renewed determination. "I know this is a lot to process, and I know you're worried about me. But for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I belong." David studied his mother's face, seeing not the fragile cancer patient he'd brought to the mountains, but a woman awakening to herself. The transformation was remarkable, but it also frightened him. What if this journey into the past led somewhere dangerous? What if whatever had threatened her as a baby was still out there? "Okay," he said finally. "We'll look for whatever this key opens. But promise me something. If we discover something that seems unsafe, we'll consider leaving." Eleanor smiled and kissed his forehead. "I promise we'll be careful. But David, I don't think I can leave now. This place is healing me in ways I don't understand, but I can feel it happening. It's like my body remembers being here, remembers being whole." As evening approached, they began searching for what the brass key might unlock. Every desk drawer, every closet, every cabinet in the cabin. But it was Eleanor who found it almost by instinct, running her hands along the stones of the fireplace until she found one that shifted slightly under pressure. Behind the loose stone was a small metal box, locked and waiting. The brass key turned smoothly in the small metal box, as if it had been waiting 38 years for this moment. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, Eleanor found a folded piece of parchment that felt ancient beneath her fingers. When she carefully unfolded it, both she and David gasped. It was a hand-drawn family tree, meticulously crafted with delicate pen strokes and small illustrations. The Whitmore name appeared at the top, with branches extending back through generations. Thomas James Whitmore and Margaret Rose Whitmore occupied the center, with a line extending down to Eleanor Rose Whitmore, born May 15, 1955. But what made Eleanor's hands tremble was the information surrounding her parents' generation. Next to Margaret's name was a small notation, "Keeper of the Old Ways." 7th generation, next to Thomas, "Guardian of the Sacred Grove." 9th generation. "David, look at this." Eleanor pointed to the margins of the parchment. where someone had written notes in various hands across different time periods. It goes back to the 1800s, but some of these entries look much newer. David studied the family tree more closely. The branches showed marriages between families with names like Brightwater, Moonheart, and Stormcrow, names that suggested Native American heritage mixed with European settlement families. But it was the gaps that troubled him most. "Mom, look here." He pointed to several places where branches had been deliberately cut short, with small symbols drawn beside them. "These look like death markers, but they're all from the same time period. The 1950s and 1960s. Eleanor traced her finger along the truncated branches, counting. 7 families, all ending around the time I was born. "David, what if whatever threatened me also threatened these other families?" They spent the evening examining every detail of the family tree, but the more they learned, the more questions arose. The documents suggested their family had been part of something much larger, a network of families with specific roles and responsibilities that went back generations. The next morning, Eleanor woke with renewed purpose. "We need to search this cabin systematically," she announced over breakfast. "If my parents left me this key and this family tree, there must be more information hidden somewhere." They divided the cabin into sections, Eleanor taking the main floor, while David continued exploring the upper rooms. In the parlor, Eleanor found a secretary desk with dozens of small drawers and hidden compartments. Most contained typical household items, buttons, thread, old receipts, but in the smallest drawer, she discovered something that made her call for David. A leather portfolio contained what appeared to be official documents, but not the kind typically found in family papers. There were surveyor's maps showing the cabin's property boundaries, but with additional markings that didn't appear on any standard survey. Circles marked specific locations throughout the 3 acres, with notes like primary source, secondary flow, and convergence point. "It's like they were mapping something underground," David said, spreading the papers across the kitchen table. "Look, these lines don't follow property boundaries or terrain features. They're following something else entirely." Eleanor studied the maps with growing excitement. "Remember what Margaret wrote about the healing place? What if this property sits on something special, something that actually has healing properties?" David wanted to dismiss the idea as wishful thinking, but he couldn't ignore his mother's remarkable recovery. Her oncologist had been clear that her type of cancer rarely went into spontaneous remission. Yet Eleanor seemed to grow stronger every day they stayed at the cabin. That afternoon, they were interrupted by the sound of a truck engine laboring up the rough mountain road. Through the kitchen window, they watched an ancient pickup truck navigate the ruts and stones, finally coming to rest beside David's Honda. The man who climbed out was easily in his 70s, weathered and lean, wearing clothes that suggested a lifetime of outdoor work. He approached the cabin slowly, his eyes taking in every detail of their presence. "You'd be Eleanor," he said when she opened the door, his voice carrying the weight of mountain winters and long silence. "I'm Pete Morrison. My family's been looking after this place since you folks disappeared." Eleanor stepped onto the porch, studying the old man's face. "You knew my parents?" "Knew them? Child, my daddy was part of the search party when they vanished. I was just 16 then, but I remember. Been waiting near 40 years for someone from the family to come back." Pete's eyes moved to David. "Though I expected you'd come alone." "This is my son, David." Pete nodded slowly. "Margaret's grandson. You look like Thomas around the eyes." He glanced at the maps still spread on the kitchen table, visible through the open door. "I see you've been finding things." "That's good. But it's also dangerous. Some secrets have been buried for good reason." Eleanor felt a chill, despite the warm afternoon. "What kind of secrets?" "The kind that got your parents killed," Pete said quietly. "And the kind that'll get you killed too, if you're not careful about who you trust." Pete Morrison sat heavily in Thomas's old rocking chair on the front porch, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee Eleanor had brought him. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines, casting long shadows across the clearing. And for several minutes no one spoke. You said my parents were killed, Eleanor finally said, settling into the chair beside him. But the adoption papers Margaret wrote said they disappeared. Pete reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a yellowed newspaper clipping, folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn white. This ran in the county paper 3 days after you were taken to your new family. Read it? Eleanor unfolded the clipping carefully. The headline read, "Local couple missing. Foul play suspected." Below was a grainy photograph of Thomas and Margaret. The same formal portrait that hung above the cabin's fireplace. Thomas and Margaret Whitmore of Cascade County have been reported missing after failing to appear for scheduled appointments, Eleanor read aloud. The couple's newborn daughter was found unharmed in their mountain cabin by family friends and has been placed with relatives. Sheriff's deputies discovered signs of a struggle and are investigating the disappearance as a possible homicide. David leaned over his mother's shoulder. It says they found signs of a struggle, but Margaret's letter made it sound like she gave Eleanor up voluntarily. Pete spat into the dirt beside the porch steps. That letter was written under duress, son. Your grandmother was a smart woman. She knew they were coming for her family, so she made arrangements to get Eleanor to safety. But she didn't leave voluntarily. Who was coming for them? Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. Developers. Government men. People who'd heard stories about this land and wanted to claim it for themselves. Pete's eyes grew distant. See, your family wasn't the only one that knew about the healing properties of this place. Word gets around, especially when people start recovering from things that modern medicine says are incurable. Eleanor set down her coffee cup. You know about the healing, child. My own daddy was cured of lung cancer right here on this property back in 1951. Your grandfather Thomas showed him the sacred places, taught him the old ceremonies. Daddy lived another 25 years after the doctor said he had 6 months. David felt a chill run down his spine. How many people knew about this? Too many, Pete said grimly. By the mid-50s, word had spread beyond the mountain communities. Rich folks from the cities started showing up, wanting to buy the land, build resorts, commercialize the healing springs. When your parents refused to sell, things turned ugly. Eleanor studied the newspaper clipping again. But why didn't anyone investigate? If there were signs of a struggle, if people suspected murder, who do you think owned the newspaper? Pete asked. The same development company that wanted this land. The sheriff was on their payroll too. The investigation was a sham from the start. Pete stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the forest that surrounded them. Your parents weren't the first to die protecting this place, and they won't be the last. The Brightwater family, all killed in a car accident in 1957. The Moonhearts house fire took the whole family in 1959. One by one, the Guardian families were eliminated. Then why are we safe now? David asked. If these people were willing to kill for this land 40 years ago, what's changed? Pete turned back to them, his expression grim. Who says you're safe? You think it's coincidence that this cabin came up for sale right when Eleanor got her cancer diagnosis? You think it's coincidence that the price was exactly what David could afford? Eleanor's hand went to her throat. Someone wanted us to come here. Question is whether they want to help you or hurt you, Pete said. The old families, the ones that survived, we've been watching this place for decades, waiting to see who would eventually claim it. Some of us hoped Eleanor would find her way home. Others, he shrugged. Others think the bloodline should end with her generation, that it's too dangerous to continue. David stood abruptly. Are you threatening my mother? Son, I'm the reason you're both still breathing, Pete said calmly. My family's been running interference for a week now, ever since you arrived. But I can't protect you indefinitely, especially if you keep digging into things you don't understand. Eleanor rose from her chair, and David was surprised by the steel in her voice. Pete, I appreciate your family's protection, but I'm not leaving. This place is healing me in ways I can't explain, and I need to understand why. If there are people who want to hurt us, then we need to know who they are and how to stop them. Pete studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You've got your daddy's stubbornness and your mama's courage. That combination got them killed, but it might be what saves this place." He started toward his truck, then paused. "Eleanor, if you're determined to stay, you need to learn the whole truth. There are things about this land that go back a lot further than your family. Meet me tomorrow at dawn at the old stone circle, and bring that family tree. You're going to need it." Eleanor couldn't sleep that night. Pete's warnings echoed in her mind, but they were overshadowed by something else, a pull she felt toward the forest, as if the land itself was calling to her. She rose before dawn and dressed quietly, not wanting to wake David, then slipped out of the cabin into the cool mountain air. The stone circle Pete had mentioned wasn't hard to find. Her feet seemed to know the path through the trees, following a trail that was barely visible but felt as familiar as walking through her own home. The circle sat in a natural clearing where 7 large stones had been arranged in a perfect ring, each one carved with symbols that looked both ancient and somehow familiar. Pete was already there, sitting on one of the stones and watching the eastern sky lighten. "Knew you'd come early," he said without turning around. "The land's been calling to you, hasn't it?"
"How did you know?"
"Because it called to your mama the same way. And your grandmama before her." Pete gestured for her to sit on the stone opposite him. "This is where the healing starts, Eleanor. This is the heart of what your family's been protecting." As the sun crested the mountain peaks, Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that spread outward from her heart to her fingertips. The sensation was unlike anything she'd experienced, as if her body was remembering something it had forgotten long ago. "What is this place?" she whispered. "Older than the cabin, older than the white settlements, older than most things on this continent." Pete's voice carried a reverence that made Eleanor look at him more closely. "Your family tree shows the European bloodlines, but it doesn't show the other half. Your great-great-grandmother was Blackfoot, one of the traditional keepers of this sacred site." Eleanor touched the symbols carved into the stone beneath her. They seemed to pulse with warmth under her fingers. "The healing isn't just the mountain air. No, child. It's this. It's you. The bloodline carries the ability to channel the earth's healing energy, but only in certain places, and only for those who truly need it." Pete pulled out a leather pouch and scattered what looked like tobacco around the circle. "Your mama understood this. She kept a record of everything." Later that morning, back at the cabin, Pete led Eleanor to a section of the kitchen floor where the boards seemed slightly different from the rest. With David's help, they pried up 3 planks to reveal a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a waterproof metal box containing a thick journal bound in soft leather. Eleanor recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, but these weren't the gentle garden notes she'd found in the cottage. These entries were urgent, detailed, and increasingly frightened. "March 12th, 1955, Eleanor read aloud. "The healing circle called to me again last night. Eleanor moves so much when I'm near it, she knows. Thomas says she'll be powerful, maybe more than any of us have been. The responsibility frightens me." David leaned over her shoulder as she turned pages. The entries grew more specific, documenting Eleanor's unusual responses as an infant to being near the sacred sites, her rapid development, and Margaret's growing awareness that their daughter was somehow different. "April 30th, 1955, Eleanor continued. "Men came to the Brightwater place today asking questions about land surveys and mineral rights. Frank Brightwater turned them away, but I saw the look in their eyes. Thomas says we need to prepare for what's coming. He's been teaching me the protection ceremonies, but I'm not sure I'm strong enough." The journal entries painted a picture of mounting tension as various families reported visits from strangers asking pointed questions about their land, their health, and their family histories. Margaret documented strange incidents, cars following them to town, phone calls where no one spoke, people watching their cabin from the tree line. "May 10th, 1955, Eleanor read, her voice barely steady. "Thomas found surveyor stakes on our property this morning. Someone's been marking our land without permission. When he tried to remove them, men appeared from the forest, armed men who told him to leave the stakes alone. They know about Eleanor. Somehow they know what she is. The final entries were the most chilling. Margaret described a growing network of people who seemed to be watching all the Guardian families, documenting their activities and waiting for something. The last entry was dated May 14th, the day before Eleanor's birth. They're coming tonight. Thomas has prepared the emergency plan. If anything happens to us, the Morrison family will get Eleanor to safety. I pray she'll never have to know about any of this, but if she ever returns to this place, she needs to understand. The healing power isn't a gift. It's a responsibility that people will kill for. The land chooses its guardians, but guardians must choose whether to accept the burden. Eleanor closed the journal and looked up at Pete. She knew they were going to die. She knew the risks, Pete corrected gently. But she also knew that some things are worth dying to protect. The question now is whether you understand what you've inherited, and whether you're willing to accept the responsibility that comes with it. That afternoon, Eleanor felt drawn to explore the master bedroom more thoroughly. David had found the music box there, but something told her there were more secrets waiting to be discovered. She moved through the room methodically, running her hands along the walls, checking behind picture frames, and examining every piece of furniture. In the large wardrobe that dominated one wall, she pushed aside clothes that still smelled faintly of lavender and found a small jewelry box tucked behind the hanging garments. The box was made of the same cedar as the chest in the attic, and when she opened it, the familiar melody of Fur-Elise began to play. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a silver locket that took her breath away. The front was engraved with a delicate tree whose branches formed an intricate pattern, and when she pressed the tiny clasp, it opened to reveal two photographs. One showed Thomas and Margaret on their wedding day, young and radiant with hope. The other made Eleanor sink onto the edge of the bed. It was a photograph of herself as a baby, perhaps 3 months old, being held by Margaret in front of the stone circle. Even in the small, sepia-toned image, Eleanor could see that she was reaching toward the standing stones. Her tiny hands stretched out, as if trying to touch something beyond the camera's view. "David," she called softly. He appeared in the doorway, took one look at her face, and immediately sat beside her on the bed. "What did you find?" Eleanor showed him the locket, watching as his expression shifted from curiosity to amazement. "Look at the picture," she said. "I was just a baby, but I was already responding to the sacred site." David studied the photograph closely. "Mom, look at the background. Do you see that glow around the stones?" Eleanor looked more carefully and gasped. There was indeed a faint luminescence visible around the stone circle in the photograph, as if the stones themselves were emanating light. But more unsettling was the expression on Margaret's face. Not the joy of a mother with her child, but something closer to awe mixed with fear. "She was scared of what I might become," Eleanor whispered. They spent the evening going through every photograph in the cabin, creating a timeline of Eleanor's first few months of life. The pictures told a story of a baby who was never quite normal. In image after image, Eleanor appeared to be reaching toward unseen things. Her eyes focused on empty spaces as if she could see something others couldn't. One photograph particularly disturbed David. It showed Eleanor at perhaps 4 months old, lying in her crib, but floating several inches above the mattress. Margaret's hand was visible at the edge of the frame, reaching toward her daughter with obvious urgency. "This isn't possible," David said, studying the image under the lamplight. "Babies don't just levitate." Eleanor took the photograph from him, and as her fingers touched the surface, she felt a jolt of memory, not visual, but emotional. She remembered the sensation of floating, of being surrounded by warmth and light, of feeling completely safe and connected to something vast and loving. "I remember this," she said softly. "Not with my mind, but with my body. I remember feeling weightless, feeling like I belonged to the sky as much as the earth." David set down the photograph and looked at his mother with new eyes. "Mom, what if Pete was right? What if you're not just healing here because of the mountain air? What if you're healing because this place recognizes you? Eleanor walked to the bedroom window and looked out at the forest. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and she could feel the land settling into evening around her. There was a rhythm to it, a pulse that seemed to match her own heartbeat. "I can feel it," she said. "The land. It's alive in a way I never understood before. And it knows me." She turned back to David. "When I touch the stones in the circle, when I walk through the forest paths, it's like the earth is welcoming me home. Not just to this cabin, but to something I was always meant to be." David joined her at the window. "And that scares you." "It terrifies me," Eleanor admitted. "Because if I accept this, if I embrace whatever I'm supposed to become, there's no going back to my old life. And there are people who will want to stop me, just like they stopped my parents." Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Eleanor could see the path to the stone circle from the bedroom window, and as she watched, she could swear she saw a faint glow emanating from the clearing where the ancient stones stood. "David," she said quietly, "I think tomorrow we need to learn everything Pete can teach us, because I don't think we can keep running from this, and I don't think we can hide from it either." As if in response to her words, a warm breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something that smelled like home. The next morning, Pete arrived at the cabin carrying a canvas bag and wearing an expression more serious than Eleanor had yet seen. "Time to show you what's really under this land," he said without preamble. "But first you need to understand something. Once you see what I'm about to show you, there's no pretending this is just about family history anymore." Eleanor nodded, feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. "I'm ready." Pete led them not to the stone circle, but to what appeared to be a natural depression in the forest floor about 50 yards behind the cabin. Fallen leaves and decades of forest debris had filled the hollow, making it look like nothing more than a slight dip in the terrain. "Help me clear this," Pete said, pulling a collapsible shovel from his bag. As they worked, David began to notice that the depression wasn't natural at all. Hidden beneath the organic matter were carefully fitted stones, forming what looked like steps descending into the earth. The more they cleared, the more obvious it became that they were uncovering a deliberate construction. "This is why they wanted the land," Pete said as they worked. "Not for development, not for timber or mineral rights. For this, at the bottom of the stone steps, they discovered a heavy wooden door set into what appeared to be a natural rock formation. But as Eleanor approached it, she realized the rock wasn't natural either. It was carved, shaped into the form of a doorway by hands that had worked centuries ago. Pete produced an ornate iron key from his bag. "Your daddy gave this to my father the night before they disappeared. Said if anyone from the bloodline ever came back, we were to bring them here." The key turned easily, and the door swung open to reveal a passage descending into the earth. Cool air flowed up from the depths, carrying scents of mineral water and something else, something that made Eleanor's skin tingle with recognition. Pete lit a battery-powered lantern, and they descended stone steps that had been worn smooth by countless feet over countless years. The passage opened into a circular chamber carved from living rock, its walls covered with symbols and pictographs that seemed to shift and dance in the lantern light, but it was the center of the chamber that took Eleanor's breath away. A stone altar rose from the floor, its surface carved with intricate patterns that matched the symbols on her skin when she concentrated. Around the altar, 7 smaller stones were arranged in a perfect circle, each one glowing with a soft, pulsing light that seemed to come from within the rock itself. "Sacred ceremony site," Pete said, his voice hushed with reverence. "Been here for over 1,000 years, maybe longer. The Blackfoot people found it first, recognized it for what it was. When the white settlers came, some of the families intermarried with the indigenous keepers. That's how your bloodline got started." Eleanor stepped toward the altar and immediately felt the air around her begin to shimmer. The glow from the 7 stones intensified, and she could hear something, not quite sound, not quite music, but a vibration that seemed to resonate in her bones. "What is it?" David whispered. "Healing chamber," Pete replied. "The Earth's energy concentrates here, flows up through the rock. People with the right bloodline, the right training, they can channel it, direct it, use it to heal things that modern medicine says are impossible to heal." Eleanor placed her hands on the altar, and the entire chamber filled with warm, golden light. She could feel the cancer that had been eating away at her body for months simply dissolving, not fighting, not being destroyed, just peacefully dissolving as if it had never belonged there in the first place. "My God," David breathed. Staring at his mother, Eleanor looked different, not just healthier, but somehow more substantial, more present. The hollow exhaustion that had marked her features since her diagnosis was completely gone, replaced by a vitality that seemed to radiate from within. "This is what they killed my parents for," Eleanor said, her voice strong and clear. "Not the land itself, but what's under it. They wanted to control this, to own it, to use it for their own purposes." Pete nodded grimly. "And they'll kill you for it too, if they find out you're here and what you can do. This kind of power, it threatens everything the modern world is built on. Hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, the whole medical industry. What happens to all of that if word gets out that there are places where people can be healed just by being in the right spot with the right bloodline?" Eleanor lifted her hands from the altar, but the glow in the chamber didn't fade. If anything, it grew brighter, as if her touch had awakened something that had been sleeping. "They're not going to kill me," she said quietly, "because I'm not going to hide anymore. This place, this power, it's not meant to be hidden away. It's meant to heal people." David stared at his mother, seeing in her face a determination he'd never witnessed before. "Mom, if you're talking about making this public, I'm talking about accepting my birthright," Eleanor interrupted, "and fulfilling the responsibility that comes with it, no matter what the cost." As Eleanor's eyes adjusted to the chamber's mystical light, she began to notice details that had been hidden in the shadows. The walls weren't just carved with random symbols. They told a story, painted and etched by generations of hands across centuries of time. Pete moved his lantern closer to one section of wall, revealing intricate petroglyphs that seemed to come alive in the dancing light. "These are the original records," he said. "The true history of this place and the families who've protected it." David traced his finger along one series of images, careful not to actually touch the ancient artwork. "It looks like a timeline. See here, these figures represent different generations, and these symbols seem to show them performing ceremonies at the altar." Eleanor approached a section of wall that seemed to draw her attention, and as she neared it, the petroglyphs began to glow with the same warm light that emanated from the altar stones. She could see now that the images weren't just decorative, they were instructional, showing the proper techniques for channeling the Earth's healing energy. "Look at this," she called softly to David and Pete. "These figures here, they're showing how to place hands on the altar, how to position the body, even how to breathe during the healing ceremonies." Pete nodded with approval. "Your bloodline carries the memory in the genes, but the conscious knowledge was passed down through these walls. Every keeper learned by studying these images and practicing the techniques they showed." One panel particularly captured Eleanor's attention. It depicted a woman with long dark hair standing at the altar, her hands glowing with the same light that surrounded Eleanor now. Around her were figures representing sick and injured people, and rays of healing energy flowed from the woman to each person in need. "That's not just any healer," Pete said, following Eleanor's gaze. "Look at the symbols around her head." Eleanor studied the petroglyphs more closely and gasped. The woman in the ancient drawing wore a crown of 7 stars, and beneath her feet were the same intricate patterns that covered the altar's surface. But most striking was the fact that the woman's face, though stylized in the ancient art form, bore an unmistakable resemblance to Eleanor herself. "She looks like me," Eleanor whispered. "She was you, in a sense," Pete replied. "The prophecies carved here speak of a healer who would be born with the full power, who would come to the sacred site during a time of great darkness and awaken the sleeping energy. The bloodline has carried the potential for centuries, waiting for the right combination of genetics and circumstances. David moved to another section of wall where different petroglyphs showed what appeared to be conflict. Armed figures surrounded the sacred site, while the healers retreated into hidden chambers. This shows the persecution, doesn't it? The times when the keepers had to hide their abilities. Many times over the centuries, Pete confirmed. The Spanish conquistadors tried to destroy the sacred sites. Later, Christian missionaries declared the healing practices to be witchcraft. In modern times, government agencies and corporations have attempted to claim the land for their own purposes. But the keepers always found ways to preserve the knowledge and protect the sacred places. Eleanor continued studying the wall, and one panel made her heart race. It showed a woman giving birth while surrounded by the healing energy, and the child being born was depicted with the same 7-star crown as the powerful healer. Below this scene, other panels showed the child being taken away for safety, growing up far from the sacred site, then returning as an adult to claim her heritage. "This is my story," Eleanor breathed. "Born here, taken away for protection, returning to accept my role as a healer." Pete smiled. The ancestors knew this day would come. They prepared for it, left instructions, preserved the knowledge through the darkest times. Even when families were scattered or killed, they made sure the truth would survive. As Eleanor moved through the chamber, each section of petroglyphs seemed to respond to her presence, glowing brighter and revealing details that had been invisible moments before. She could see techniques for healing different ailments, ceremonies for strengthening the connection between healer and earth, and warnings about the responsibilities that came with such power. One final panel showed multiple healers working together, their combined energy creating a network of light that extended far beyond the sacred chamber. Lines of force connected different sites across vast distances, suggesting that this wasn't the only place where such healing was possible. "There are others," Eleanor said, pointing to the petroglyphs. "Other sites, other families." "Were others," Pete corrected sadly. "Most were destroyed or lost over the centuries. A few may still exist, but the knowledge of how to find them and activate them died with the keeper families." Eleanor placed her palm flat against the wall, and the entire chamber suddenly blazed with light so intense that Pete and David had to shield their eyes. When the light subsided, new petroglyphs had appeared on the previously blank sections of wall. Fresh images showing Eleanor's own face, David's presence, and symbols that seemed to indicate a new chapter in the ancient story. "The chamber is updating itself," Pete said in amazement. "Recording your awakening for future generations." Eleanor looked around the chamber with new understanding. This wasn't just an ancient healing site. It was a living record of power passed down through bloodlines, a sacred trust that demanded everything from those chosen to receive it. Eleanor emerged from the underground chamber, feeling fundamentally changed. The healing energy still thrummed through her body, and she could sense the forest around her with startling clarity. Every bird's heartbeat, every insect's movement, every tree's slow pulse of life. But with this heightened awareness came an overwhelming sense of responsibility that settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Back at the cabin, Pete spread out documents he'd brought from his own family's archives. "Now that you've awakened the chamber," he said, "there are things you need to understand about what you've committed to." Among the papers was a thick document written on parchment that felt ancient beneath Eleanor's fingers. The text was in multiple languages: English, Spanish, French, and what appeared to be various Native American scripts. At the top, in elegant script, were the words, "Sacred Covenant of the Guardian Families." This agreement was signed by representatives of 7 bloodlines, Pete explained, pointing to signatures at the bottom of each page. Made in 1847, when the first white settlers began arriving in numbers that threatened the sacred sites. Eleanor read through the covenant carefully, David looking over her shoulder. The document established specific responsibilities for each guardian family, territorial boundaries for their protection, and protocols for passing knowledge from one generation to the next. But it was the final section that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Should any guardian choose to abandon their sacred trust, she read aloud, or should they reveal the existence of the healing sites to those who would exploit them for personal gain? The covenant binds all remaining families to ensure that such betrayal does not endanger the sacred places or the people they serve. David looked up at Pete. That sounds like a death sentence. It is, Pete said grimly. The families who have survived this long take the covenant very seriously. There have been incidents when guardians tried to walk away or profit from their abilities. Eleanor set down the document and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the forest that now felt like an extension of her own body. You're telling me that if I try to leave here, the other guardian families will kill me. I'm telling you that the covenant has protected these sites for over a century and a half, Pete replied. And that protection has required difficult choices. What other families? David asked. You said most of the guardian bloodlines were eliminated. Pete pulled out a modern folder containing what appeared to be surveillance photographs and typed reports. 3 families survived by going completely underground. The Brightwaters managed to fake their deaths and relocate to Canada. The Stormcrows integrated into a reservation in Montana where their abilities could be hidden among traditional healing practices. And my family, the Morrisons, stayed here to watch over the abandoned sites. Eleanor studied the photographs of people who looked remarkably similar to her. The same dark hair, the same intense eyes, the same indefinable quality that suggested hidden depths. They know I'm here. They've known since the day you arrived, Pete confirmed. The question has been whether you would awaken your abilities or remain dormant like your mother hoped. My mother wanted me to remain powerless. Your mother wanted you to live, Pete corrected. She knew that awakening your full potential would mean accepting responsibilities that could get you killed. The covenant doesn't just protect the sites, it binds the guardians to serve until death. David stood abruptly, pacing to the fireplace. So my mother's choice is to become some kind of mystical healer for the rest of her life, or face execution by surviving guardian families? The choice was made the moment she placed her hands on the altar, Pete said quietly. The sacred sites don't release their guardians. Once awakened, the connection becomes permanent. Eleanor turned from the window, and both men could see that the light in her eyes had intensified. When she spoke, her voice carried a resonance it hadn't possessed before. Pete, you keep talking about this as if I'm trapped, as if the covenant is some kind of prison. But what if it's not? What if it's exactly what I'm supposed to be doing? Eleanor, David started. No, listen to me. She moved to the center of the room, and both men could feel the energy radiating from her. I was dying, David. The cancer was winning and modern medicine had given up on me. But here in this place, I'm not just healed. I'm more alive than I've ever been. And if I have the ability to help other people feel this way, if I can save lives that would otherwise be lost, how is that a burden? Pete smiled for the first time since Eleanor had known him. That's what your parents hoped you would say when the time came. They didn't see the covenant as a chain. They saw it as a sacred calling. Eleanor picked up the covenant document again, studying the signatures of her ancestors. Then I need to meet the other families. I need to understand what we're really protecting and how we can do it better. That meeting was arranged for tonight, Pete said. At the stone circle under the full moon. The Brightwaters and Stormcrows have already arrived. As evening approached, Eleanor felt the pull of the stone circle growing stronger. It was as if invisible threads connected her to that sacred space, drawing her forward with an irresistible force. David walked beside her through the forest, carrying a small bag that Pete had given him containing items needed for the ceremony. Are you sure about this, Mom? David asked, as they followed the familiar path through the pines. Once you do this ceremony, Pete says there's no going back." Eleanor paused and took her son's hand. "David, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. For the first time, I understand who I'm supposed to be." When they reached the stone circle, Eleanor gasped. The 7 standing stones were glowing with the same warm light she'd seen in the underground chamber, but now the glow was visible even in the twilight. 3 figures stood waiting among the stones, and as Eleanor approached, she could feel the power radiating from each of them. The first was a woman about Eleanor's age, with silver-streaked black hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths of ancient wisdom. She stepped forward and extended her hands to Eleanor. "I am Sarah Brightwater. Your mother saved my family's life by warning us about the men who came for the Guardian families." The second figure was a man in his 60s, with weathered features and traditional Native American jewelry. His voice carried the weight of mountains when he spoke. "I am Joseph Stormcrow. My grandfather knew your great-grandmother. The bloodlines have waited long for your awakening." The third person surprised Eleanor. A young woman, perhaps 25, with the same intense eyes that marked all the Guardian families. "I'm Maria Santos," she said with a slight accent. "My family carries both Stormcrow and Brightwater blood. I've been trained to assist in the awakening ceremonies." Pete emerged from the shadows, carrying what appeared to be a staff made from polished wood and wrapped with feathers, stones, and other objects Eleanor couldn't identify in the growing darkness. "This belonged to your father," he said, offering it to Eleanor. "Thomas carried it when he performed his guardian duties." The moment Eleanor's hands closed around the staff, she felt a jolt of connection that nearly brought her to her knees. Images flashed through her mind. Her father using this same staff to heal a child's fever, her mother channeling energy through it to ease an old man's arthritis, generations of her ancestors wielding it in service to others. The ceremony begins. "At moonrise," Sarah said, gesturing for Eleanor to take her place at the center of the circle. "But first you must understand what you're accepting. This isn't just about healing people, Eleanor. It's about becoming a bridge between the Earth's power and human need. You'll feel every person you heal carry part of their pain, experience their gratitude and their desperation. It will change you in ways you can't imagine." Eleanor looked around at the faces surrounding her, all marked by the same profound sense of responsibility she was beginning to understand. "How do you bear it? How do you carry that much weight?" "Joseph." Stormcrow smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "You don't carry it alone. The Earth carries it through you, and you share it with the other Guardians. We are connected now, Eleanor, part of a network that spans centuries." As the full moon crested the mountain peaks, its light fell directly on the stone circle, causing the ancient symbols carved into each stone to glow with silver fire. Eleanor could feel the energy building around her, flowing up from the earth through her feet, down from the sky through the crown of her head. "Place the staff on the central stone," Maria instructed. "Let the moon's light touch both it and you simultaneously." Eleanor stepped forward and laid her father's staff across the flat surface of the central stone. As moonlight struck both the polished wood and her upturned face, the entire circle erupted in brilliant light. Energy poured through Eleanor with such intensity that she felt herself expanding beyond the boundaries of her physical body. She could sense David's concerned love, Pete's protective devotion, and the deep reverence of the other Guardians. But beyond that, she could feel the network Joseph had spoken of. Threads of connection reaching out to other sacred sites, other Guardians, other people in desperate need of healing. In that moment of cosmic connection, Eleanor understood her true purpose. She wasn't just meant to heal individuals, she was meant to help restore the balance between humanity and the Earth itself, to serve as a conduit for the planet's own healing energy. When the light finally subsided, Eleanor found herself changed at the cellular level. The staff in her hands pulsed with warmth, and she could see streams of energy flowing between the standing stones like visible rivers of light. "Welcome, Guardian Eleanor," Sarah said formally. "Your training begins now." Eleanor smiled, feeling complete for the first time in her life. She was home. 3 months after the ceremony at the stone circle, Eleanor stood in the garden behind the cabin, watching the morning mist rise from the forest floor. Her hands moved with practiced certainty as she tended to herbs that hadn't grown on this land for decades, but had somehow begun sprouting the day after her awakening. David emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a leather-bound journal they had purchased in town. "Another early morning in the healing garden?" he asked, settling beside her on the wooden bench he'd built near the herb beds. Eleanor accepted the coffee gratefully and opened the journal to a page half filled with her careful handwriting. "I want to make sure we document everything," she said. "The families who come after us will need more than just the ancient petroglyphs. They'll need practical guidance, written in language they can understand." Over the past months, word had somehow spread through networks Eleanor was only beginning to understand. People arrived at their mountain cabin seeking help, not through any advertisement or publicity, but guided by dreams, intuition, or whispered recommendations from others who had been healed. A cancer patient from Denver, a child with a rare genetic disorder from Phoenix, an elderly veteran whose PTSD had resisted all conventional treatment. Eleanor had helped them all, working with the Earth's energy to facilitate healing that defied medical explanation. But each healing took something from her, required her to temporarily absorb the illness or trauma before transmuting it through her connection to the sacred sites. It was exhausting work that left her drained for days afterward. "Today's entry," she said, pen poised over the page, "should cover Mrs. Patterson's arthritis treatment. The technique Sarah taught me about channeling energy through water worked perfectly." David smiled, remembering the elderly woman who had arrived 3 days ago, barely able to walk, and left yesterday dancing to her car radio. "You should also write about the importance of rest between healings. You pushed yourself too hard with that family from Seattle." Eleanor nodded and began writing. The Seattle family had brought their autistic son, hoping Eleanor could cure him, not understanding that her abilities worked with illnesses and injuries, not neurological differences that were part of who a person was meant to be. She'd spent hours explaining that healing meant helping people become their best selves, not changing their fundamental nature. "The hardest part isn't the physical drain," she wrote in the journal. "It's helping people understand that not everything needs to be fixed, and that true healing sometimes means accepting ourselves as we are while releasing what doesn't serve us." A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, and Eleanor looked up to watch its graceful flight. Since her awakening, she had developed an almost telepathic connection with the wildlife around the cabin. The hawk was her regular companion during morning, garden time, and she'd learned to interpret its flight patterns as messages about approaching visitors or changes in the weather. "Someone's coming," she said, interpreting the hawk's circular pattern. "A family, I think. The hawk says they're bringing great sorrow." David had learned not to question his mother's new abilities. "Do you know what kind of help they need?" Eleanor closed her eyes and extended her awareness beyond the immediate area, feeling for the emotional signatures that preceded visitors to their sanctuary. "A child," she said softly, "very sick, and parents who are desperate." She opened her eyes and looked at David. "We should prepare the healing chamber." As they walked toward the hidden entrance to the underground sanctuary, Eleanor reflected on how much their lives had changed. David had taken an indefinite leave of absence from his job in the city, becoming her assistant and protector as she learned to navigate her new responsibilities. He'd proven surprisingly adept at the practical aspects of running a healing sanctuary, managing supplies, maintaining the cabin, and helping visitors understand what they could realistically expect. David Eleanor said as they descended the stone steps. "I need you to know how grateful I am that you stayed. This calling, this responsibility, it's mine, but I couldn't fulfill it without your support." David lit the lanterns that illuminated the ancient chamber, watching as the 7 stones began their familiar glow in response to Eleanor's presence. "Mom, I wouldn't be anywhere else. Watching you heal people, seeing the joy and relief in their faces, it's shown me that there are purposes in life bigger than anything I thought I was working toward." Eleanor opened her journal again and wrote, "The Guardian's family becomes part of the healing mission. Their sacrifice and support are as essential as the bloodline abilities. Future Guardians should remember that this calling transforms not just the chosen one, but everyone who chooses to stand with them." Outside, they could hear a car struggling up the mountain road, bringing another family seeking hope in an ancient place of power. 6 months after Eleanor's awakening, David spread architectural drawings across the kitchen table where they had once studied maps of the property's mysterious underground features. These new drawings showed his vision for expanding their healing sanctuary while preserving the sacred nature of the land. "I've been working with Maria Santos," David explained, pointing to detailed sketches of small cabins nestled among the trees. "Her family has experience building structures that complement sacred sites rather than disrupting them. These guest quarters would allow families to stay during extended healing treatments." Eleanor studied the plans with interest, noting how David had positioned each cabin to follow the natural flow of energy lines they discovered crisscrossing the property. The main paths connected to the stone circle and underground chamber, while secondary trails led to quiet meditation spots and the expanded herb gardens. "You've learned to see the energy patterns," Eleanor observed with pride. 6 months ago, you would have designed this based purely on practical considerations." David smiled, rolling out another set of drawings. "Maria's been teaching me to sense the land's preferences. It sounds mystical, but there's actually a logic to it. The places where the Earth's energy flows strongest are also the places where people heal fastest." The second set of plans showed improvements to the main cabin, a larger kitchen, capable of preparing meals for multiple families, additional bathrooms, and a library where Eleanor could store her growing collection of healing knowledge and guardian histories. But it was the proposed meditation hall that caught Eleanor's attention. This would be built directly above the underground chamber, David explained. "Maria says the energy would flow upward through the floor, creating a space where people could prepare for healing ceremonies or simply find peace." Eleanor traced her finger along the meditation hall's circular design, which echoed the shape of the chamber below. "It's beautiful, David, but can we build all this without attracting unwanted attention? The more visible we become, the more likely we are to draw the kind of people who destroyed the other Guardian families." "That's why we're planning it in phases," David said, producing a timeline chart. "We start with the guest cabins, which just look like a family compound from the outside. The meditation hall comes later, and only after we've established better security measures." Pete Morrison had been helping with those security measures, using his family's knowledge of the mountain terrain to create early warning systems for unwelcome visitors. Trail cameras disguised as birdhouses, motion sensors hidden in hollow logs, and a network of local contacts who would alert them to strangers asking too many questions about the Whitmore property. "The other Guardian families are contributing too," David continued. "Sarah Brightwater's people have experience with legal protections, incorporating as a religious retreat, establishing conservation easements that prevent development. Joseph Stormcrow's family is teaching us traditional concealment techniques that have protected sacred sites for centuries." Eleanor walked to the window and looked out at the clearing, where she could see the foundation markers David had already placed for the first guest cabin. The sight filled her with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Every expansion of their healing work increased both their ability to help people and their risk of discovery by those who would exploit or destroy what they'd built. "There's something else," David said, joining her at the window. "Maria thinks I might have some latent abilities of my own. Not healing exactly, but a capacity to strengthen and stabilize the energy flows around sacred sites. She wants to teach me some basic techniques." Eleanor turned to study her son's face, seeing new lines of maturity that hadn't been there a year ago. The boy who had brought her to this mountain cabin, seeking only to ease her final months, had grown into a man with his own sacred calling. "Are you prepared for what that might mean?" Eleanor asked gently. "The abilities come with responsibilities, David. Once you open yourself to this work, it becomes part of who you are." David nodded seriously. "I've been thinking about that. Watching you transform from a cancer patient into a guardian, seeing the joy you find in helping people heal. I want to be part of that work. Not just as your assistant, but as someone with my own gifts to offer." Eleanor embraced her son, feeling the strength and determination that had carried him through the challenges of the past months. "Then we'll build this sanctuary together," she said. "A place where healing can happen safely, where families can find hope, and where the ancient knowledge can be preserved for future generations." As evening approached, they walked together to the stone circle, where Eleanor performed her daily ceremony of gratitude to the land and the ancestors who had preserved this sacred place. David stood beside her, learning the rituals that might one day become his own responsibility. In the distance, they could see the lights of Pete's cabin and knew that other guardians were performing similar ceremonies at their own sacred sites, maintaining the network of protection and healing that spanned the continent. 1 year to the day after Eleanor first placed her hands on the ancient altar, she stood in the same underground chamber reading from a leather-bound book where visitors recorded their healing experiences. The chamber was no longer the forgotten relic they had discovered. Soft lighting illuminated the walls, wooden benches provided seating, and photographs of healed families lined the ancient petroglyphs. "I came here with Parkinson's disease," read the most recent entry in shaky handwriting. "I leave with steady hands and hope for the future. This place is a miracle. But more than that, Eleanor and David have created a sanctuary where healing feels like coming home." The book contained dozens of similar testimonials. A mother whose child's leukemia had gone into remission, a veteran whose nightmares had finally stopped, a woman whose chronic pain had disappeared after years of suffering. Each story represented not just physical healing, but the restoration of hope in families who had given up. David descended the stone steps carrying tea and settled beside his mother. "The Kowalski family just left," he said. "Their daughter's diabetes is completely stable now, and they're planning to return in 6 months." Eleanor smiled, remembering the terrified parents who had arrived 2 weeks ago with a 7-year-old girl whose blood sugar levels had been dangerously unpredictable. Working with the child had required delicate adjustments over multiple sessions. Mrs. Kowalski asked if we have a waiting list. David continued. "Word is spreading faster than we anticipated." Eleanor closed the visitor's book and looked around the chamber that had become the heart of their healing practice. Ancient walls now held modern additions, thank you letters, healing notes, and documentation of their growing work. "I never imagined it would grow this quickly," Eleanor said. "When we first discovered this place, I thought healing a few people would be enough. I didn't understand that we were meant to restore something that had been lost for generations. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. They'd had to turn away people whose conditions were beyond even the sacred site's power to heal, learning that their abilities had limits. They'd also dealt with visitors seeking miracle cures for aging or death itself, people who didn't understand that healing meant restoring balance, not defying natural law. David had proven invaluable in screening potential visitors. Using intuitive abilities, Maria Santos had helped him develop to sense whether someone was genuinely seeking healing. His gift for stabilizing energy flows had made Eleanor's work more effective and less draining. "Sarah Brightwater called this morning," David said. "The site in Canada is ready to begin accepting visitors again. They've found someone from the bloodline willing to train as a guardian." Eleanor felt a surge of joy. The Brightwater family had been working for months to restore their own sacred site, dormant since the 1950s persecution. Having multiple healing centers active again would distribute demand and reduce the risk of any single location becoming too visible. And Maria Santos says the young man from the Moonheart family is showing strong abilities, David added. He might be ready to awaken the Montana site within the year. Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility lifting from her shoulders. When she had first accepted the guardian role, she had felt alone in carrying the burden of healing. Now she understood that she was part of a revival, a restoration of an ancient network that could serve thousands across the continent. That evening, Eleanor wrote a new entry in the visitor's book. "Today marks 1 year since I discovered my true calling. This sacred place has taught me that healing is not about fixing what is broken, but about helping people remember what they have always been capable of becoming. The land chooses its guardians, but guardians must choose to serve something greater than themselves. I'm grateful for the choice that brought me home." Outside the chamber, they could hear the evening sounds of forest settling into night. Tomorrow would bring new families seeking hope, and Eleanor would be ready to serve them with skills that grew stronger each day. 2 years after her awakening, Eleanor stood in the cabin's main room, surrounded by items she and David had carefully selected for a special purpose. On the table lay a waterproof metal container, similar to the one her parents had hidden beneath the kitchen floorboards, but larger and designed to hold the accumulated wisdom of their healing work. "The letter should go on top," David suggested, holding the sealed envelope Eleanor had spent weeks writing. Inside were instructions for future guardians, warnings about the responsibilities they would inherit, and encouragement for those who might feel overwhelmed by their calling. Eleanor placed the letter carefully in the container, then added her detailed healing journals, documenting techniques for treating different conditions. Each entry included not just the physical methods, but also the emotional and spiritual preparation required for effective healing. These weren't the ancient petroglyphs or her mother's fear-filled diary. These were practical guides written by someone who had mastered the guardian role. "The photographs should be protected too," Eleanor said, wrapping pictures of their successful healings in oiled cloth. The images showed families before and after treatment, capturing not just physical transformations, but the restoration of hope and joy that accompanied true healing. David added copies of the architectural plans for their expanded sanctuary, along with detailed maps showing the energy flows throughout the property. Future guardians would need to understand how the sacred sites connected to each other and how to maintain the delicate balance that made healing possible. "Maria Santos wanted us to include this," David said, placing a small carved wooden figure in the container. The figure depicted a woman with her hands raised toward the sky, surrounded by symbols representing earth, water, fire, and air. "She says it's blessed by all the surviving guardian families and will help future keepers remember they're not working alone." Eleanor smiled, touching the figure gently. The past 2 years had brought her into regular contact with the other guardian families, and she'd learned that each sacred site had its own specialties. The Brightwater location in Canada excelled at healing respiratory conditions, while the Stormcrow site in Montana was particularly effective with trauma and emotional wounds. The mountain sanctuary had proven most powerful with cancers and autoimmune disorders. "The network is stronger than it's been in 70 years, Eleanor said, adding a hand-drawn map showing all the active sacred sites. "Whoever finds this container will inherit not just our site, but connections to healers across the continent." The most precious item going into the container was Thomas's ceremonial staff, carefully wrapped and nestled among the other treasures. Eleanor had carried it during every healing ceremony, and it had absorbed the energy of hundreds of successful treatments. A future guardian could learn more from touching that staff than from reading volumes of instruction. "Do you think we should include a warning about the corporations?" David asked, holding a folder containing newspaper clippings about pharmaceutical companies and medical research facilities that had been asking questions about alternative healing sites in rural areas. Eleanor considered this. The past year had brought increased attention from people who viewed their work as either a threat to established medicine or an opportunity for profit. So far, Pete Morrison's security measures and the legal protections established by the Brightwater family had kept them safe, but the danger was always present. Yes, she decided. Future guardians need to understand that the healing power will always attract those who want to control or commercialize it. They need to be prepared to protect what we've built. David added the warning documents, then sealed the container with wax and special markings that would indicate if it had been tampered with. They planned to bury it in the underground chamber, where the sacred site's energy would preserve it and where only someone with guardian abilities would be able to sense its presence. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, producing a small digital recorder. "I want to record a message, something personal that documents won't capture." She spoke into the device for several minutes, her voice warm and encouraging as she addressed the unknown guardian who would someday find their time capsule. She talked about the joys and challenges of the calling, the importance of trusting the land's wisdom, and the deep satisfaction of helping people rediscover their capacity for healing. "Remember," she concluded, "the power doesn't make you special. The willingness to serve others makes you worthy of the power. Use it with humility, protect it with courage, and never forget that you are part of something much larger than yourself." As evening approached, they carried the sealed container to the underground chamber. Eleanor placed it in a specially prepared niche where future guardians would find it when they were ready to accept the full weight of their inheritance. Looking around the chamber that had become so familiar, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion. They had not only restored the sacred site, but ensured its knowledge would survive for generations to come. 5 years after David, Chen first spotted that impossible $500 listing for a mountain cabin. He stood on the same wraparound porch where they had first arrived, but everything had changed. Eleanor emerged from the cabin carrying a steaming cup of herbal tea, her movements graceful and strong, bearing no trace of the fragile cancer patient who had made this journey seeking only a peaceful place to die. "The Hendersons should be here within the hour," Eleanor said, settling into the rocking chair that had once belonged to Thomas Whitmore. "Their son's leukemia is aggressive, but I can feel the land preparing to receive him," David nodded, adjusting the camera he'd set up on a tripod nearby. After 5 years of documenting their healing work, he'd learned to recognize the subtle signs that preceded each family's arrival, the way the forest grew quieter, how the stone circle's energy intensified, the sense of anticipation that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. "Before they arrive," David said, "I want to take that photograph we discussed." Eleanor smiled, understanding immediately. On the mantelpiece inside the cabin, the original family portrait of Thomas, Margaret, and their children still held the place of honor. But beside it now sat an empty frame that Eleanor had been saving for this moment when they finally felt ready to complete the visual story of their family's journey. They positioned themselves in front of the cabin, Eleanor in her favorite chair and David standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder. The mountain peaks rose behind them, and the afternoon light filtered through the pine branches exactly as it had in the original Whitmore family portrait. But this photograph would capture something the earlier one couldn't, the visible evidence of transformation and purpose fulfilled. Eleanor's face glowed with the inner radiance that came from years of channeling healing energy. David's features showed the wisdom and confidence of someone who had found his true calling. Both of them carried the unmistakable mark of people who had discovered what they were meant to do with their lives. "Ready?" David asked, setting the camera's timer. Eleanor nodded, and as the shutter clicked, she felt a profound sense of completion. This image would join the others on the mantelpiece, completing the circle that had begun with her birth in this cabin 68 years ago. From the baby floating in her crib to the dying cancer patient who had arrived seeking only comfort, to the powerful healer she had become, the visual record would tell the story of a destiny fulfilled despite decades of separation from her true home. After the photo session, they walked together to the stone circle for Eleanor's evening gratitude ceremony. The ritual had evolved over the years into something deeply personal, combining elements from the ancient petroglyphs with practices Eleanor had developed through experience. As she placed her hands on the central stone, the familiar warmth flowed through her, connecting her to the network of guardians across the continent. "I've been thinking about the expansion plans," Eleanor said as they walked back toward the cabin. "The Hendersons' visit will bring us to our 100th successful healing. I think it's time to build the meditation hall," David smiled. Over the past 5 years, they had helped 99 families find healing for conditions ranging from childhood cancers to degenerative neurological diseases. Each success had strengthened Eleanor's abilities and deepened their understanding of how the sacred site's energy could be directed most effectively. "Maria Santos says her nephew is ready to begin guardian training," David added. "With the Montana site fully active now, we could start accepting more visitors without overwhelming any single location." Eleanor looked out at the forest that had become her true home, feeling the deep contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The frightened woman who had arrived here expecting to die had been transformed into someone who helped others remember their capacity for healing and hope. "You know what I've learned in all these years," Eleanor said as they reached the cabin's front steps. "Home isn't just a place you're born. It's a place where you become who you were always meant to be." David embraced his mother, marveling at how their desperate search for a peaceful place to spend her final months had led them to discover their life's true purpose. Above them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and from the forest came the gentle sounds of the mountains settling into evening. Inside the cabin, Eleanor carefully placed the new photograph in its frame on the mantelpiece. The image showed a mother and son who had found their calling in service to others, their faces radiant with the joy that comes from living in complete alignment with one's deepest purpose. Tomorrow would bring new families seeking healing, and Eleanor would be ready to serve them with abilities that continued to grow stronger with each passing year. She was home, finally and forever, in the place where healing lived.